So thank you all so much for being here. My name is Teresa Sweetland. I'm the Executive Director of Forecast Public Art. I'm also the publisher of Public Art Review magazine, and happy to have you here for our Forecast Forward conversation series. This is the second in a series of 4 this fall. Our first was about a month ago at All My Relations Gallery on the topic of decolonizing public art, and we have a part 2 for that in December. I just wanted to start out by asking that we take a moment to acknowledge and thank the Dakota people whose ancestral lands that we hold this conversation tonight, and I ask that we pay our respects to them and their culture, past and present. I also wanted to thank the Cowles Center that we're in, this beautiful space. Thank you to Cowles and to ArtSpace for giving us the space for tonight and making this place a community resource for all of us. Just happy to be here. And to our speakers, all of you who came downtown tonight on a really busy night. So nice to see all of you. Before I turn it over to Hally to facilitate the conversation, I just want to say a few words about Forecast if you're not familiar with us. So Forecast Public Art is a local nonprofit organization. We're based in St. Paul, but we work regionally and around the country. We were founded 40 years ago by a group of artists wanting to work in public space and community. We do 4 main things. We support artists in their professional development, financially and through training. We also are a partner to a lot of public and private partners like cities, libraries, universities, transportation programs, planners, other neighborhood groups, and others who want to work with artists, and we help them do that. We also are a storyteller, so we publish a magazine called Public Art Review, and we've been publishing that for over 30 years, telling the stories of this work and public art practices and placemaking nationally and internationally. And then finally, we offer training, workshops, and resources for people who want to do this kind of work. So the focus of this conversation in the Forecast Forward series is really, we're really proud of the stories that we tell in our magazine, but we wanted to bring them to life in conversations in community. And so we have our upcoming issue of the magazine, which is going to come out in a couple of weeks, has a great feature story about the Community Vitality Fellowship at MnDOT and other programs where artists are embedded into programs like this across the country in transportation. So we wanted to hold this conversation here locally to kind of bring that story off the pages and hopefully get you excited to find out more. And just a quick note before we get started, as you see there's cameras around. We are filming and documenting these conversations so that there's a lot of people who wanted to hear this and that can't be here, and so we'll be posting them. And we're really happy to have Media Active here, which is a group of youth media producers based in St. Paul who are learning the skill of documentation and filmmaking and media here tonight. So thank you to all of you with Media Active. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce Hally Turner. So Hally is Planning Program Coordinator at MnDOT, and she's also a new Forecast Public Art Board member. She works statewide advancing equity in transportation, planning for connected and automated vehicles, and coordinating updates to and implementation of the 20-year statewide multimodal transportation plan. That's a mouthful. Yeah. Hally previously worked on the Council on Crime for Justice, Ramsey County Community Corrections, American Academy of Neurology, and Washington County. So I'm going to hand it over to Hally to facilitate this great conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Before we get started, I thought it'd be helpful to know who's in the room so that we understand how you're coming to us and what your interest is. I have a couple of categories. They're not mutually exclusive, and I will have you raise your hand. Who here works in transportation? Right, about half. Who here is an artist? Fantastic. Planners? Great. Any engineers? Yay, we have an engineer. And then interested public, or because your partner is sitting on the panel. Well, thank you, that's helpful. It helps us to understand why people are here so that we don't descend super deep in being wonky when you start talking about transportation, art, placemaking. We'll define these terms in just a moment. You can start to dig in deeply really quickly. For those planners that are AICP certified for continuing maintenance credits, we will ask that you need to stay for the duration of the event. sign in at the registration table, and fill out an evaluation form. I will remind you at the end of the event to make sure that we get those evaluation forms submitted. I do provide this information to the Minnesota chapter of the American Planning Association. I would also encourage you to think early and often about questions that you have for the panelists. I think this would be a much more engaging conversation if you are a part of it. After a few introductory questions, we will just have you start shouting them out. You can raise your hand, I'll call on you. I think it's a small enough space that you can yell it at me. I'll repeat it back into the microphone, and then we'll have a conversation. To start with, I have brief bios. I did confirm with each of these individuals that they were okay with me doing shorter remarks and then deferring to them to fill in gaps. I would like to introduce first Marcus Young, who is on your right, my far left. Marcus Young is a behavioral and social practice artist. His work expands the repertoire of human behavioral practice and the expressivity of city systems. Since 2008, Marcus has been creating Don't You Feel It Too, a participatory street dance practice of public protest and inner life liberation. He is currently a Community Vitality Fellow at Minnesota Department of Transportation. Next, we have Jessica in the middle. Jessica O is developing a new program to encourage public-private partnerships to care for and enhance the use of Minnesota State Highway right-of-way as the Highway Sponsorship Program Director at MnDOT. I should have read the end of that sentence. MnDOT's Highway Sponsorship Program supports enhanced leadership, enhanced landscaping, pollinator habitat, art, placemaking, and other enhancement projects in the right-of-way. And then we have Ben Stone. He's the Director of Arts and Culture at Smart Growth America and its program Transportation for America. Ben leads the organization's broad efforts to help communities across the country better integrate arts, culture, and creative placemaking into neighborhood revitalization, equitable development, and transportation planning efforts. Help me welcome our three panelists. And we will be starting with Marcus. Marcus, can you tell us what on earth a Community Vitality Fellow is and why you were interested in this role at the Minnesota Department of Transportation?
Thank you, Hally, for the first question. Good evening, everybody. I think even before I address the question, if I could, I'd like to go rogue already.
Go rogue.
I just decided,
we
like
10
seconds, I wasn't listening to the last 10 seconds of your introduction of Ben's biography because I was like, wait a minute, what am I going to do? So what I'd like to do is address our space and how we're gathered for just a brief moment, which is, this is a beautiful lobby, and I feel like I'm kind of up against this white wall, and I would like to do something just to make myself a little bit more comfortable in this space so that we can have as intimate and friendly of a conversation as possible. And without wreaking havoc for the videographers, I would just like to invite everybody here to do something, make some adjustment that will make you more comfortable and more present in the space. Now, that could be shifting to a different position, putting your feet up, moving to a different location. It could be taking off your shoes. I know that might sound weird, but I might do that myself. I would love to be a little bit closer to you all. So some of this you might need to negotiate with somebody else. Like, is it okay, Jessica, that I've moved forward a little bit? Okay. Hi, Teresa. So, okay, so then this is just a little adjustment, but I welcome everybody back there as well, right? You don't have to stay back there. And if you feel the urge to adjust throughout our time together, go ahead and do it, right? Because I think it's great when we all can be in this space together, allowing each of us to be just the way we want to be, and that we get to see each other in a more friendly, relaxed, hopefully comfortable way. I probably will be putting on and taking off my scarf, depending on. Feels like it's cold, but then I'm not quite sure. Okay. All right, so again, I encourage everybody to do that throughout the time. Thank you for indulging me. So the question was, what the heck is a Community Vitality Fellow, and why did I choose to apply? Okay, the short answer is I have no idea what this is. And I want to acknowledge that, so oftentimes I like making analogies to sushi. And what I mean by that is, it's probably feeling like the first time a sushi restaurant opened in Minnesota, and the first customer walked in and ordered raw fish. And the first time you put it in your mouth, you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And maybe you have other people watching you and like, are you actually gonna do that? Talking about Minnesotans who'd never had raw fish before. And so I don't know how long ago that was, 30, 40, 50 years or something like that. And today, probably not quite you can go down to the Holiday gas station to buy sushi, but something close. What's that? Walgreens. Really? Walgreens? Okay, so it's close, okay. So we've come a long way, and I wanna just say that the Artist in Residence program, as I understand it, is brand new to this MnDOT context. So that's why I'm making the analogy to sushi. It's like, that's where we are, that first restaurant, that first bite, that first customer. And maybe in X number of years, it'll be like, we'll have a Artist in Residence that's housed in the Connected and Automated Vehicles division of MnDOT. And we'll have one in Office of Land Management. So who knows where this might go, but right now it's brand new, and so part of my job is to do that early exploratory, so the probe out into outer space, like, what's out here? Like, that's the approach, that's how it feels at times. What am I doing here? I am an alien, and thank you for welcoming me to your planet. That kind of feeling. Gotta come in peace. So having said that, I do come with having spent 9 years housed in the Public Works Department at the City of St. Paul, through a very similar kind of triangle relationship of a government agency welcoming in an individual artist, another entity, a nonprofit that sort of holds the space, helps make the bridge, builds the trust, and then this third entity, myself, what I call kind of a viral artist. The virus who comes into the host organization, swims around, looks around, finds something to attach itself to, and tries to make some change on the cellular level. And as I used that analogy when I was in St. Paul, the Mayor Coleman at the time said, remember to tell everybody you're not an evil virus, you're an inoculation. So I was interested in seeing if any of the 9 years at the city could scale up. And maybe a little bit of background is that this fellowship, this position, this Artist in Residence position, is along with Washington DOT, the first of its kind where an artist is housed in a statewide agency. And I don't know about you, but I love the challenge of thinking about creating art in the context of the city. And then to think about the context of the state, I don't know if my mind has the capacity to think that big, and I'm sure gonna try, but that's gonna be a big challenge. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that I am really interested in the art life question. How is life art and how is art life? And my particular take on that is that everything can be art. But something about the way we grow up or something about our society tells us that art is just this one thing. And I feel like my role is to help shift systems and shift awareness so that all of us can have that feeling that everything is art and that our lives are our greatest creations, and that we should work on our lives every day like we are working on a work of art. A little bit like when you, and I used this analogy earlier today with Ben, with the automated vehicles unit in MnDOT. You can tell that the words don't trip off my tongue very easily yet. And that is when you go to Hong Kong or Paris or New York and you're not from there, everything is art. Every moment is art. A cup of coffee is art. You know, looking at people is art. But if you are the New Yorker or the person in Hong Kong or the person in Paris, that's just your everyday life. And for us here, this is our everyday lives. But if we are able to make a shift in our awareness, in our consciousness, actually everything is art. That same cup of coffee is art. And I would even hold that this moment that we're sharing together, you know, as we sit here, as we notice the strange humming in the background, and we take a moment to notice the light in this room and the temperature of the air on our skin and the people in this room, you know, gathered here, and what's happening outside, and our own breath, that just by doing that little shift in awareness, that little shift in our seat or the little shift in the room, helps us understand that what we're doing is a little bit more artful. And if I can bring any little bit of this to MnDOT in the way that MnDOT gathers and engages people, and internally as a culture as well, if there's anything that I can do to help us all realize that really we're here working on this huge endeavor of making beautiful, artful, just lives. And one day, a couple weeks ago, I was having a conversation with the office director of the Office of Land Management. And you know, I was really new, it was one of my first days there. And I said, you know, I'm a layperson, Joe. Can you tell me what's the most important thing to you about MnDOT? What's the thing you want me to remember the most and that you want MnDOT to know going forward and never lose sight of? And he surprised me with this phrase. He said, MnDOT is about and should be about the freedom of movement. Meaning, if you need to go see a loved one, you can get there safely and affordably and accessibly. If you need to go to the corner store, if you need to, wherever you need to go, if you need to just go for going's sake and not feel stuck, that sense of freedom of movement is what we're really about at the core. And of course, then I said to him, I said, well, that means you would be in favor of renaming the department. Instead of the Department of Transportation, it should be the Department of Freedom of Movement. You know, much more aspirational. Maybe the Department of Transportation is more like an engineering label for the department. And it's okay to have an engineering label, but maybe it's also good to have a much more aspirational, emotional, evocative name for the department. And it wasn't always called the Department of Transportation, right? It used to be called Highways Department, yeah. So that conversations like that begin to engage all of us in having an emergent, imaginative space for our emergent belonging. Imagining a space where we all can belong more and better and together. And we need to have conversations around that, and then hopefully we need to have little works of art that shift our consciousness and awareness so that we see that we're all responsible for that. Not just the artists, but the artists are there to remind us, don't forget, this is what you're here for. You're here to make beautiful, creative, and just lives for all of us. Okay.
Thank you, Marcus. We went from sushi to space to breath. I am always mesmerized in how you explain your capacity, and it really instills a lot of inspiration in me that MnDOT can do this. We're going to ground ourselves a little bit. We're going to go from space a little bit back to ground to make sure that we're all on the same page around art, creative placemaking. Smart Growth America and Transportation for America spends a lot of time and resources in this space. So I was hoping, Ben, that you can help us understand, why would an organization called Transportation for America care about art? What does art and transportation mean? And can you help us understand, what is creative placemaking?
Sure, I can do that. I'll try to think of a good sushi analogy to use in the next few minutes. It's not coming to me quite yet. I'm also realizing I'm the only person up here without notes in my lap, so hopefully I'll think of something useful to say. And on that note, so maybe I'll give a couple different answers, because I think none of my coworkers are here, so I can say this. I have my own rationale and reason for why I'm interested in art and transportation. Then I have my organization. I just realized I'm being recorded, so other people will see this. But then there's the organizational reason why we are interested in having an art in transportation program, and there's 95% overlap and a couple of different reasons as well. So I'll start at the beginning. My background is in the visual arts. I worked on public art projects way back in the day, went to art school as an undergrad, and then moved on and did a planning program for graduate school, and have been working to try to combine those two different disciplines ever since, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully, and sort of veering more in the successful direction, I think, these days. And I joined Smart Growth America and our program Transportation for America, which is a big component of what we do as SGA, or Smart Growth America, almost 4 years ago now, at the same time that about 8 or 9 other people joined, 8 or 9 other national organizations, including the Trust for Public Land, the Urban Land Institute, LISC, PolicyLink, a whole bunch of other national organizations, all kind of working on different subsections of the quote-unquote community development world. In my case, of course, transportation. Other cases, housing issues, park design issues, equity issues, and a lot of overlap as well between those different things. And that whole cohort of people, all of us working in national organizations, funded largely, at least at the start, by the Kresge Foundation, we're really interested in taking an arts and culture lens, arts and culture approach, arts and culture strategies into the work that we do. So in my case, it's about bringing an arts and culture approach to the world of transportation. My colleagues in other disciplines are doing that same work in the housing field, and so on and so forth. And we've all taken different angles with that work. For me, a lot of it has been about, I'd say in some ways, bribing transportation professionals, actually subgranting money to agencies and different states and cities to work with artists, since there's not a proven, scientifically proven kind of track record of explaining why working with an artist will guarantee your project will be finished faster and on a lower budget, because actually probably the opposite may very well happen, of course. I've also done a lot of research. I wrote a field scan, which you can find on our website, about art, culture, and transportation, appropriately called Art, Culture, and Transportation. I should have come up with a better title for that one. And that work was about a year of tracking different projects, artists working on light rail projects and road safety projects and highway projects and pedestrian safety projects, all kinds of different things. And a couple of things came out of that. The partners I was working with at Art Place America, when I finished that, came to me and said, so what are you going to do next? We have some funding to do the next iteration of this. What did you learn after talking to people for a year about what artists are doing in the transportation world? And sort of rack my brain and come up with a couple of different ideas, one of which, relevant to meetings we had earlier today, was about the fact that for the most part, artists are still really deeply engaged in things like bus shelters and crosswalks and very low-tech transportation infrastructure sorts of things, putting art on bridges and embedding art in concrete and things that are really kind of in the hardscape infrastructure world out there. And there really are not many artists, and correct me if I'm wrong if any of you know about this, involved with the future we're all going to inherit with autonomous vehicles moving around, or autonomous pods, or even what we can probably see out the window, micromobility things like scooters and bike share and things like that. And a lot of the imagining of what the future will look like is being set by the private sector, who's trying to sell us a future that they will then benefit from. And I think that is understandable and not necessarily a huge issue, as long as there's kind of a counterbalance of other people creatively thinking about what is the dystopian version of that if we let this go too far in a direction we're not really that interested in, or what is 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of futures. And I give MnDOT actually a lot of credit for doing some of that work internally themselves, from the public sector side as well. So that was sort of one angle that didn't really go anywhere, so I shouldn't really talk too much about that. The other angle is the fact that artists are still working primarily at the local level, which is sort of an obvious place for most artists to start. If you want to make a difference in your community, your first stop is probably working with your maybe planning department or your Department of Transportation or your city council. Neighborhood association, sort of the first level of government you reach, rather than going up a level of bureaucracy to the, 5,000 person staff of MnDOT, or in Washington State, 7,000 people on staff and dealing with that level of bureaucracy. There's all kinds of barriers to entry to doing that kind of work. So I didn't want to just, accept the fact that that was not going to happen. And there's, of course, tons of artist in residence programs at the local and municipal level here in Minneapolis and St. Paul and Austin, Texas, and Seattle and New York and Boston. The list goes on and on and on. But as of a couple months ago, 0 at the state level, and now there are 2. Thanks to all the folks up here and folks out in Washington State. And so I pitched that idea to our place, and that's where this idea actually came from, and that's how we all ended up here in this room today talking about this work. But to answer your other question about what we're really aiming to get out of it, so I joined my team sort of after the team existed without any people occupying the positions. We were doing some work on art and transportation. It was largely focused on the fact that transportation professionals are required to do community engagement work. You can't design a highway or a light rail or really anything without talking to the people who will be using the system. So there is the kind of back and forth, and a lot of that work is left up to people trained as engineers or even planners, or people that don't know how to do that kind of work and don't have the deep-seated community connections to do that work successfully. And we found a lot of success all around the country with working through artists and arts organizations and cultural organizations who have this kind of deep understanding of how people use space, which is not the same in every community and not the same for every person within a community as well. So that's where a lot of our work is focused. And then the last question you asked, I think, was kind of a definition of creative placemaking. Am I remembering that correctly? Yes. And I had a conversation about this with a coworker earlier this week, and we were talking about all the many different, I've had this conversation with many people in the room over the last few months and years even. My coworker was asking me, what is my definition? I realized I don't actually fully know. I know how I talk about it. And without a slide behind me, I can't tell you what the official National Endowment for the Arts definition of creative placemaking is. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I have not committed it to memory, so I won't try to tell you what that is. But the way that I usually talk about it, well, the first thing I usually do is I ask people in the audience who can define creative placemaking. I like to subcontract my work out to the audience. Anybody?
I know it when I see it.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like pornography in that way, right? Yeah, do you want to?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, I never tell anyone they're wrong when they give me a definition, because I don't know what the real definition is or should be in the future, and it means a little bit of something different to everyone. But so I often ask audiences what they think it means, and I often tell people a couple different things. One is that rather than giving a definition, I usually explain it as that if you were to work on a project out there, redesign Hennepin, or work on a light rail expansion, or rerouting of buses, or a housing project, or anything that's going to impact our lives, anything that's going to have a physical component that'll impact space. And we started to think, who do we need to talk to? Who do we need at the proverbial table to work on this team? You'd probably think maybe an architect, an engineer, civil engineer, planners, often elected officials, neighborhood representatives. But as you go through the list, oftentimes artists or culture bearers, however you want to define quote-unquote artists, are not part of that list. And creative placemaking is simply just this paradigm shift to say, artists should be on that list, just without having to think about it and having someone come by afterwards and say, hey, you should have had artists as part of this project. Now that you're through 90% design, you should add an artist to the team. It's really just about adding an artist at the beginning and getting to the point where we all understand that there's a role for the artist to play. And the other simple definition I use that is used by art places, they often talk about the fact that most people think when you say creative placemaking that what people mean is that we're talking about making spaces creative or making places creative, in the sense that you have a place that maybe doesn't feel like it is quote unquote made and needs to be made, and that might mean adding a work of public art, adding an art space, adding something creative that is visually understandable as a work of art, and that could certainly be creative placemaking, but creative placemaking is really more about the idea of switching, this is a very nerdy grammatical definition of changing it from making places creative to making places creatively, that it's about the process of how it's made. So again, involving an artist at the beginning, as Marcus did very appropriately at the beginning, changing the way we even relate to each other in a room like this, shifting things around, thinking about how we talk to one another, how the meeting is structured, who is invited, how we can do things differently, since we all know, I mean, in the transportation world, we talk nonstop about how last generation, all the plans we did and all the projects we did were wrong, and yet we're somehow going through the same processes and expecting to get different results now. So it's all about trying to not just come up with different results through the same processes, but changing the processes and then getting to different results. And the very last thing I'll say before I use up all the time, because I said I was going to tell you my own personal goals, and then I'd sort of talk myself out of it, and now I've talked myself back into saying it again, is that my own personal goals of the work I do now is trying to find this very, very niche sweet spot of working on projects, supporting projects and programs that could both stand up to an artistic criticism, meaning they're meaningful artistic projects, but could also stand up to a presentation in, let's say, the American Planning Association conference, and would make sense to planners and engineers as well, and finding this little narrow sliver in that Venn diagram of things that planners and engineers and people involved in civic processes, as well as the arts world, care about. And that's sort of where I'm focusing my attention. With that, I'll stop talking for now.
Thank you for sharing, Ben. If you come up with that secret sauce on finding that niche that works, please share it, because I think there would be a lot of people that would appreciate that. Jessica, Minnesota Department of Transportation is one of only 2 state DOTs that has an artist in residence. Given that with the context of we are the first to the table, first in the door getting sushi, what was some of the motivation for MnDOT, and where do we see arts and placemaking in our vision?
So other than the fact that in Minnesota we compete with Washington State because we're above average here, right? Everyone is above average, and so we have this sort of thing with Washington State around excellence, and interestingly enough, I think we're both often at the top of the heap in terms of innovation, and as someone who used to work in Washington, D.C., I think that is true with many issuers. So we're very proud to be part of the pilot. You know, just sort of reflecting on what my colleagues have shared, I think that participation in this initiative is really, you know, and kind of an outcropping of a couple different areas at MnDOT. So first and foremost, MnDOT has made extensive investments in public engagement in the last, 5 years or so. And communities can further sort of articulate how they would like to see their values, their assets, their cultural, their social, all those elements really come through in transportation. It's really a natural extension of us trying to form deeper relationships with different voices. So I think that there's something about the process of working with artists that is so exciting to kind of animate and excite and really look at how we take those voices and incorporate those suggestions to produce a better transportation system. So at the most basic level, I think there's a huge opportunity there. We were also really excited because this program has the vision of really uniting a lot of different areas of practice within MnDOT, from multimodal folks to sustainability, to our strong equity vision, to how we use land, a huge range of different areas. This is a chance for us to kind of bring all those folks together and have a very focused way of really how we elevate communities and really how we elevate the solutions. So we couldn't be more excited, and I think that the sort of second area that really kind of led us to this is the national conversation in transportation around a framework that's called Community Connections, that is being put forth by FHWA, that really helps us sort of take an honest look at how transportation has harmed communities in the past, how communities bear the impacts of transportation, how we actually use feedback in very meaningful ways, how we elevate those historically underserved communities, how we have innovative partnerships, how we are willing to step out of the box of transportation and look to health or look to arts and culture as a better way to serve communities. So I think that it's just a huge opportunity, and we couldn't be more excited to really be a part of it.
I'm going to pause for just a moment and check some of our jargon and our acronyms. So FHWA is Federal Highway Administration. We've mentioned multiple times now Art Place, which is an arts organization that does a lot of funding around public art. We heard sustainability. I think that definition is emerging at MnDOT. We also said equity. That definition should be defined by the people that have been harmed by our decisions, and we have not had that process yet, so they should set the terms by which we are doing work around equity. And so we're trying to do that work, so we don't have a definition of equity, but we have a concept of what we're working on. Also multimodal, so traveling by modes other than private automobile. Were there any other acronyms, jargon that we have not yet? All right, I think we got that.
Yeah. Can I make one more comment
Yes.
too? That we have sort of a dual purpose with this position, really. One is to, and I think that the engineers, of which I had one who said, is this an artist in residence? Are we going to put naked paintings on sound walls? Kind of thing. I mean, it was a response because people immediately think of, that this is really about public art, and this is about MnDOT's policy and how we, our aesthetic treatments, art, how we work with artists for all those elements. And it's partially about that. But I think that more broadly to the creative placemaking, it's really around how can we engage artists in creative interventions and solutions and vision through all of our processes to produce better outcomes. And I think that is a deeper exercise, but certainly we're trying to kind of do both, where we are analyzing literally how we put art on things and what we allow and what that looks like, but also how we can much more deeply integrate arts and culture with everything that MnDOT does to improve our work.
Incredible segue, because I am creative adjacent. I think I stole that word from our board president, Leah, or phrase from Leah. I'm not creative. I like the idea of being creative. I know that by working in transportation, there is a lot of space, literally, on MnDOT bridges that could be more than what I think we call MnDOT grayish, the balance between brown and gray, grayish. But you were saying that this is not naked paintings on bridges. This is not necessarily just art at transit. So can you all help me understand, as someone who is creative adjacent and new to the world of public art, how we start to move this a little bit more forward in our processes, where we bring artists to the front, as you're stating, as well as think of it more of a process as well as an outcome. And I defer to any of the three of you that could share. And Marcus, I know that your work in the city of St. Paul is a very tangible example with your sidewalk poetry that might be a good one to share of how to think more creatively, more upfront about what art can be.
Think creatively more upfront. That was the essence of your question? Can you
Sure.
say it one more time?
Yeah, help us conceptualize
Yeah.
beyond art as an object.
Yeah.
So how do we start to bring art into these processes for individuals who might not have done public art, who have not been in these processes, in these decision-making moments? Help us understand what that looks like.
I don't know if I can do that, but I will answer your other question about maybe talking a little bit about the Sidewalk Poetry Project. Also, Hally, you said you're not creative, but you're creative adjacent. I don't know exactly how I feel about that at this moment, but I might come back to that. Because we need everybody. So, sidewalk poetry. So, how many in this room have seen an example of the Sidewalk Poetry Project? So quite a few. All right. So this is a project that we started in St. Paul in 2008 that is a systems-based artwork that piggybacks onto another system. And the system that it piggybacks onto is the sidewalk maintenance system. City of St. Paul fixes about 10 miles of sidewalk every year. They rip it out, that's a sidewalk that's failing, and they replace it with new sidewalk. And that $1 million project, which is a fairly modest, unassuming system, maintenance system within the city, was where I decided to do my sort of pilot project of what is city art. So city art I think of as, and this maybe goes to more your question, is art that is made within the living systems of the city. I think of it as city behavior. I call myself a behavioral artist, so these operations and systems of the city that is the city behavior. And so making art within that city behavior or city systems is making art right at the sort of core of what the city does every day in and day out. And how you do that is you need to place artists far upstream in those systems, so they're sitting every day with their fellow engineers, planners, maintenance staff, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just one profession, as Ben was saying, that is not overlooked. And of course the joke is, you know, if the city of St. Paul has 300 inspectors, certainly we should have at least 100 artists. You know, so I mean, it just seems to make sense if you put it that way. But at the time, I was the only one, and then I was working hard to make sure I wasn't the only one, so that it became a team of artists. We never got to 100; we got to 3, but still, that was better than before. So, making sure that artists are placed high up, far upstream in the system, and yes, it includes physical objects and infrastructure, but it's not only that, it's about processes. And acknowledging, as I said before, that we are all making this art constantly, and if we're not aware of it, then maybe it's not as good as it can be. But the more we are aware that everything we do, you know, so I have to refer to Merrill Laderman Euclides, who is the artist in residence at the Department of Sanitation in New York City and has been there for more than 4 decades. And she did a project in the 70s where she went and shook the hands of every single sanitation worker, 8,000 sanitation workers. It took 11 months. And with skin-on-skin handshaking, this is a time where people were thought very lowly of sanitation workers, and even their own management did not think much of them. And so she wanted to make the point through this work of endurance art and through publicity that we need to reframe how we think of sanitation workers. Because she was a mother who had to take care of kids and change diapers, and that was sanitation work in essence. And so for this department to serve that function, to take away our crap, and let us have healthy lives because of it. So she, with every handshake, would deliver the line to each sanitation worker, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." She wanted them to know that they were essential to the life of the city and all of the residents. And why am I talking about that? I think it just proves the point that art doesn't have to be an object. It can be a social encounter. It can be a type of dedicated work of endurance and persistence and activism. And it can be the way we live together. I hope I made a point.
You did.
Did I?
You answered my question.
I did?
I might
Okay.
not have been very clear, but you answered it.
But you see that in this definition of art, actually, there's no room for any of us to say we're not creative, I think. That we have to change the way we look at art in order. So if you say you're not an artist, yes, you're not a muralist, or you're not a painter. But when we reframe art, then all of a sudden you are an artist.
I'll edit it to creative novice. I'm early. I'm working on it. Ben or Jessica, do either of you have an example to share of art more upstream?
I have a lot.
All right.
You can cut me off any time.
All right.
I'll start going. Maybe I'll start with one person and then 3 examples of projects that one person did, just to give you kind of a range. Sort of to Marcus's point that all of us are creative and all of us can be creative in many different ways. This is somebody who identifies as a sound artist and a musician, Alan Nakagawa, who was the first ever artist in residence at the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, so just like Marcus, but at the city level a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, I believe. And he did a whole bunch of different projects, and 3 of them really quickly. One, larger scale, was focused through their Vision Zero program, trying to reduce traffic fatalities all the way down to 0 from the exorbitantly high number it's at now all across the country. Was working on a whole bunch of different things, one of which was bus shelters in Los Angeles, and big city like Los Angeles, an auto-dominated city. You can imagine waiting at the bus stop for an extended period of time, not always the most pleasant experience. So his goal was to basically change the experience, have people have a better time, have people remember their experience riding the bus as a more positive experience, encourage them to come back and ride again. Of course, increasing the headway would be the best way to do that, but without a lot of funding, it's hard to pull that off. So instead, he took on the task of trying to change the smell of being at the bus stop. Many of you probably know the sense of smell is linked to your sense of memory. So if you want to establish a positive association, have a positive memory of something, linking it to a positive smell is a really good way to do that. So he worked with, I always forget the name of this, but the people who come up with scents, there's a term for this, people who work for perfume companies. Does anyone know the name? Someone Google it and let me know later. But he worked with some of those people in LA and came up with a bunch of different scents modeled after sage and things that grow naturally in Los Angeles that you might enjoy if you were out for a hike in the hills rather than sitting in a traffic-clogged street. And built these boxes where you put your hand into the box and it would squirt you with perfume, which I actually did, and I survived. I think a lot of people were a little bit nervous to try it, but some people did. You got blasted with a scent, then you had that scent with you all day and had a more positive association with the bus, in theory. Another project he did, more simply, he was working with engineers who were going out to communities and explaining their goals with Vision Zero, which often means slowing down traffic and, yes, maybe adding 2 minutes to your commute time and doing things a lot of people would yell back at him about, or back at the engineers about, and would not be excited about. But there's many different ways to present that. There's ways of using lots of jargon and acronyms, as many of us, of course, just slip into that habit. And then there's a story of talking about the 4-year-old child who was walking across the street to go to school and was hit and killed by a car, and that could have been solved so easily with a slight redesign. And isn't it worth 30 seconds of your day to slow down to get to work to save a child's life? And so he brought in a storyteller from a national organization called The Moth that may be out here. I think they're technically based in DC, but they have chapters all over the country. And they did a storytelling workshop to help engineers, civil engineers, translate technical language into simple, digestible stories for when they went out to communities to talk about the work they were doing. And third thing, kind of a different way of thinking about being an artist in residence, was that Alan is a cyclist, and the city of LA was fighting a lot with the cycling community over the ghost bikes that were being put up. Do you all know what ghost bikes are? They're bikes, unfortunately, I'm sure you'd see them around here and everywhere.
Does anyone not know what a ghost bike is? Raise a hand.
Yeah, I can explain it. So they're bikes that are essentially memorials for places where people have been hit and killed while cycling, and they're generally painted all white. They look like a ghost bike. They're chained up to the nearest public piece of infrastructure, a fence post or a stop sign, something like that, near where this crash happened. And you can imagine people who are putting this up are often pretty pissed off at the city because it might have been that some piece of infrastructure was not designed safely enough, and that led to their friend or family member being killed. And then to have the city come by and say, you can't do this, this is our property, we're going to cut this down and remove the bike, is just adding insult to not even injury, but to fatality in this case. So a lot of really bad will being created. Alan was part of this community that was adding these bikes, and so this wasn't really quote unquote art per se, or maybe it was, not in the traditional painting of a mural, but more in understanding the culture and the people within this community. He just sort of bridged that gap and made those connections and brought in the people from the ghost bike community to work with the city, and found common ground and came up with a program of, if you chain up a bike and it blocks an ADA ramp, that's not a good thing. But if you chain up a bike over here, it's actually okay to chain up a bike. Could you just talk to us about where you're going to put it? And really simple things like that are just introducing people to each other so they could sit down and come up with a common solution. And all that done under the umbrella of actually working as an artist within an agency. And he would describe that as art, and I suppose I would as well.
Thanks for those examples. Hopefully it helps us understand how we can bring art a little bit more to the forefront. Who here has questions for us? Yes.
I when you're moving from the municipal to the state level, everything scales up. I mean, the relationships are different. I've worked in an engineering firm on very large infrastructure projects and state level projects, and my background is as an artist as well, and I'm a landscape architect. And you know, you've found probably through your community engagement that art is a very high priority for most communities. But think about the process at the state level. If you can build in requirements that artists be on design teams for the firms that come to you to bid on your projects to do pre-design work or design guidelines, that might be a helpful way to get an artist upstream. I think with sanctioning by the DOT, you know, I would have had much more influence. As it is, you know, I was kind of a handmaiden illustrating others' ideas, but I wanted to contribute more. So, you know, that's the first step in a cultural change. And then, you know, providing guidance about to the firms, you know, what this all means, you know, and how it can grow, and then giving the artists parity, you know, on the team so that they can have an influence. Here's my question. Why are roundabouts so boring? And I believe in them, you know, I believe in them, and I know they work, but why are roundabouts so boring, and how could artists have something to do with that?
That's a great question. Roundabouts are very important and a kind of a hot topic in transportation, really broadly. So I think that to your prior question, you know, MnDOT takes our mission of safety extremely, extremely seriously. So when I underscore the level of seriousness that is undertaken to do the work, I can't underscore it enough. And our traffic engineers and the potential for people to lose their lives on sculptural elements or vegetation is a very real risk. And I think our folks take that risk very seriously and are trying to reduce those risks through all the various countermeasures that they can to get us towards zero deaths. So that is a very much an everyday exercise at MnDOT. So I hear you. And certainly the issue of iconic elements that we recently did a market research study on how folks in Minnesota view the aesthetics of our system. And it came up in multiple rural communities that rural communities want to differentiate themselves. They want to have thriving economies. They, you know, placemaking to them allows them to elevate their identities and really the values of their communities. So I think that how we reconcile that with a need for safety, I think there's some room there. I do. And I think that we could experiment while still carrying forth the torch with our assistant commissioner here, who is a bridge engineer and also takes safety very seriously, that there's some opportunities there. And certain communities are experimenting with different kinds of vegetation and art and sculptural elements that I think we need to test. We need to see what's reasonable while still keeping everyone safe. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and I think you're, you know, and as a landscape architect, you're elevating a lot of issues that we spend a lot of time grappling with at MnDOT around the livability of communities, the quality of life in communities. How can we be, you know, our mission is really to support thriving economies, healthy communities, thriving communities for business. All of these elements, you know, plant material and art enhance the quality of life, and our research showed that a sense of place in transportation infrastructure and the plant material that makes up our highway roadsides and our city streets is a huge part of our quality of life. So I think we're constantly trying to balance that. And I think we need additional research and scholarship and experimentation to see how we can get there. And I really think, too, that there's a huge opportunity for public-private partnerships to really leverage outside resources to support this work. right? MnDOT and most DOTs are under intense scrutiny, as they should be, rightfully so, for how we're making transportation investments. And there's a role for communities and arts and cultural organizations and philanthropy to help improve the livability of transportation infrastructure and support a softer human environment that really matters to cities and communities, and especially the communities that disproportionately bear the impact of that infrastructure. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think we're asking all those same questions, and I think we could experiment as well in innovative ways. So we're looking for ideas if you have any.
Jack, you have a question?
Well, first off, thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. I've also been interested in experimentation and exploration with these infrastructural things, and to hear MnDOT might actually want to do an experiment is news to me and exciting, Just regarding the roundabout, I've been doing public art consulting for a number of years, and I'm hearing more interest in having public art in roundabouts in cities that are adding them. And one of the points that they've made is it's safer for the motorist if they can't see through the roundabout, but rather they're forced to look at the road in front of, and therefore some kind of public art that actually blocks their view to the beyond the roundabout could actually help them focus on what they need to do in the roundabout, which would improve safety. Another idea that I've been very interested in is how to improve people's health, and how could you improve people's use of trails, like bike trails, around the state. Now, I don't know how much of that is MnDOT's work, but imagine two trails, basically the same in every respect, and limited use of them, and one of them strategic public art projects designed to attract and encourage or seduce users of those trails to increase their use, or increase families' use, or increase use by people who aren't using the trails at all, and do a study that compares those two with, say, a 1% additional budget for the art on a trail. And if it showed a huge spike in terms of the use, would that lead to more trails with more art because it's been proven effective at increasing the usage? Just ideas.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Jack, because I think MnDOT recently, with our new commissioner, Commissioner Kelleher, expanded our Office of Sustainability to expand public health as an area of focus. And how we connect those dots, I think, is really critical. And rural communities, I was recently in a rural Minnesota community, and it was a transportation event, and there were public health people there who said, you all have a very significant role to play in supporting vibrant rural streetscapes and places that people want to walk and bike from a basic public health standpoint. So I think there's something there, and I think that we need to get creative. We need to pilot these elements and, do additional research to really see what it means for communities, because I think there's connections to all of that. I concur.
Other questions?
No?
I should have left the microphone over here.
Like it was just a comment back to the comment of like the rural communities. Like I know maybe 9-10 years ago, Perry, Iowa, had a collaboration with the design school at, I think it was at Iowa State, and then it was the community, but it was all around design in the rural areas. So I don't know if they still exist, but I had to go down there and do a presentation. That's why I know about them. But that might be one group that if they're still around, they may, have some thoughts.
Actually, I would jump on to that because I think about what MnDOT controls. Obviously, MnDOT in state aid payments, there's money going out to cities, but in so many of our we have 500 cities under 1,000, and the state highway going through those small towns is really the living room. I mean, So I think of just the huge opportunity of these in rural communities in Minnesota, these roads that MnDOT controls, and there've been some fantastic things. I'm thinking of Battle Lake as a great example of everything from public art to sidewalk expansions, to trees, to mid-block alleys. I mean, just a lot added. But the potential there, sound, plants, shaping, massing. I mean, there's so much. So that would be and I'm sort of wondering if that's, in terms of, like, Marcus, where do you imagine focusing? Might that be a focus, these small towns?
Taking suggestions.
Hi, Lisa Medag. I've worked on a number of different transportation projects, and one of the things I've noticed is that when you work with artists and you work in communities on placemaking efforts, on prototyping efforts, on a range of things, what often happens is a project begins to recognize the complexity of the needs of the community that it's in. And most traditional design projects, transportation projects are no exception, are about a funnel, right, that gets narrower and narrower on choice. Like, now we're gonna have 5-foot walls. Nope, they're gonna be 5.5. So often as engineers, I see them go through these processes thinking, well, all this engagement is going to help us funnel, when really often it makes the project a lot more complicated, and there are a lot more things that need to be addressed, rather than, wait, you didn't tell me if it should be 5 or 5.5 feet, when really community is like, we don't honestly give a shit about that question. We care about these 5 things. So what are your strategies that you have in mind for working within your organization to help the people who will agonize, the engineers who are used to striving for clarity and, to deal with really what is a lot of ambiguity and complexity that comes with these really rich engagements with artists?
Who wants to start with that one?
Wow. Your question is very, very well timed, because it's literally in the last 4 days, I think we've talked about this exact topic and question like multiple times a day with Ben in town and all the various engagement of arts and culture and transportation, the fellows and everyone else. So I think we are grappling with that, honestly. And as a person who comes from a community and housing development background, the sort of cross-pollination that's happening across issue areas, transportation is, I say this with love in my heart as a new transportation professional, is sort of late to the game of really how we can effectively work with housing organizations, how we can work in health, how can we work with all these various areas, because I've heard many examples, including with the Downtown to Crosstown project that's happening currently, that the public engagement, that the number one piece of feedback that came out of that was around jobs. How can we get jobs for low-income people? People didn't want to talk about the transportation projects hardly at all. And so whether it's gentrification and displacement resulting from transportation investments, whether it's a whole range of issues, or issues of childcare, accessing healthcare in rural communities, we're just barely starting to grapple with how we would better connect the rich information and help really be more at the table for solutions that would kind of cross-pollinate. So we don't have all the answers, but I'm very grateful that you brought the issue up, because there's a shift that's starting to occur. And I think we need to get more comfortable as transportation planners and professionals with elevating those partnerships, those non-traditional partnerships, and bringing people in to have some of those harder conversations when a community says, your transportation investment could very well lead to displacement, and we can bring in housers who are working to, keep people in naturally occurring affordable housing. So why can't we help be a convener when we're having these really in-depth conversations with neighborhoods, and then really encouraging those residents to not be excluded from the benefits of revitalization. So I think we have a role to play, and I think we don't have all the answers, but we were literally just talking about this, a few hours ago in different contexts, but I'm grateful that you brought up the issue.
The mic got passed to me, so I'll say something too. A couple answers to that. It's a really important question, and I think I do a lot of work on community engagement with cities and states and used to work for a city and did this sort of work. And a lot of the advice I find myself often giving, other people often giving is, think about the time you hold the meeting, because there's childcare issues at a certain time of day, and the natural light, and the way you structure the meeting, and how you do introductions and land acknowledgements, as Teresa did before, and all this kind of stuff, which is really important. But at the end of the day, what really is the part where these meetings and these engagement processes fall apart is when you go and say, we're here to talk about whether or not this sound barrier should be 10 feet tall or 14 feet tall. And the person in the front row raises their hand and says, I'm concerned about our failing schools, and my kid is going to a school and it's just, there's no drinking water, there's no potable drinking water in my kid's elementary school. I've literally been in a meeting where we're talking about a transportation project and that comes up. And so then I'm in a position where I have to say either, we're not talking about that today. I don't care about the fact that your kid doesn't have potable drinking water in their elementary school, which nobody wants to do that. Or I say, yeah, we're going to get right on that. We're going to work on that, when I know I personally, in the role that I was in that situation, can't actually work on that. And it's sort of just like a catch-22. You're pretty much in trouble no matter what you do. So a lot of what I do, and it's kind of the opposite of what we're actually up here talking about, is the inverse of this, which is to work with communities and train them on civics, and work with artists as sort of like coming up with a gateway drug project, whether it's having people in a community paint their crosswalk in their neighborhood, or work maybe in private property to do a small-scale mural or something on public property where they have to get permission to do something really, really small, and walk them through what it means to go to your council member, or maybe your neighborhood association has to approve something, or the DOT or whoever it is, to do like the first step towards getting a yes to get something done. And then when it comes time to do the next thing, they understand that. And they start to understand, okay, well, the way you liaise with your DOT or whomever is at these certain points, and then you get asked about this at this time, and you should all self-organize because you're going to be asked about this next thing 6 months from now, and there's going to be a huge amount of money available then. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the community side of self-organizing, and that's not always that easy to do, so that everyone's meeting each other in the middle, and that the public sector is going and being honest about when they're asking things and what they're actually asking about, and the public itself is actually aware of how that process works too. So I try to work in both ways of, embedding folks like Marcus within the agency, but also working with communities as well, so they can meet this giant public bureaucracy and an even level as well.
Marcus, do you have any examples or anything you want to add about working cross-sector? Okay, no problem. It did segue to a question that I had, so thank you for that. I'm currently having conversations in greater Minnesota where we show up to talk about transportation equity, and I hear that there is no childcare in the town in which they live or where their job is, which is in a third community. And we had recently had a meeting with our commissioner who directed us to start to tap into conversations about childcare, because if we are showing up having an honest conversation with people about transportation, and we're hearing that childcare is an issue, then we need to understand that complexity so that we can see how we can meet in the middle, do a little bit of push and pull between sectors to be able to hopefully move this conversation forward. So thank you for that. We're narrowing down on time. I think we have opportunity for one short question from the audience. If we don't have one, I have a closing question for our panel, which really is getting at advice, actionable steps. So I was hoping that each of you could share with us your actionable step, call to action, recommendation for how we can advocate for bringing arts forward, bringing it upstream in the work that we do on a daily basis. I'm getting deep sighs if you can't hear them.
Anybody want to go first?
Not everyone all at once. How we can bring arts forward.
Yeah, how we can bring arts forward.
Okay.
Thank you, Jessica.
Happy to go. I would say that, to the sort of surprise that MnDOT is asking these questions and really evaluating these elements, this is a cultural shift for MnDOT. So I would encourage, for those of you that are interested in exploring these issues, consider sending us proposals, consider proposing activities to us. I think we're in a position where we want to innovate, we want to experiment, and I think we do want to signal to the arts and cultural institutions and communities that we do want to collaborate. And that, while we do have, I want to be realistic, that we do have statutory restrictions on how we use our resources for arts and aesthetic elements. That's not to say, though, that we couldn't open the door to more creative ways of utilizing artists for construction mitigation or temporary installments or other ways of elevating community voices in rural communities, to your point. So I think there's a lot of rich areas for experimentation, and I hope that we can open the door for those of you that lead arts organizations or artists to figure out ways to experiment and really see what's possible. So thank you.
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were asking for, but I would say really consider you would never take away all of the music on your phone, for example, right? And we would never say trade all of your clothes for like all gray clothes. So on that sort of very personal level, you would never ask someone to give up that element of a creative and artistic life. And so in that same spirit, go and partake in more art. Go to see more public art. Go to see more performances. Make it a part of your everyday life. Realize that that's connected to how you dress and how you carry yourself and how you listen to your music on your phone. And then we just have to start realizing that that's part of our work as well. It's not separate from our lives. So, I mean, you're looking great today, by the way, Jessica. So, I mean, work of art. Yeah, and so are we all. So, I mean, this is the easiest example. If I were to play some music on my phone for you, like, okay, let's have a dance party right now. The work of art. That's us dancing together as, live work of art.
They're both hard to follow. A couple things. I think one, there's my advice to artists in the room or artists who are watching this at some future date, the recording of this at a future date. It's really crucial and very helpful if you are going to go to an agency like MnDOT or your local DOT or any public agency for that matter and say, I'm an artist and I'm here to help, to understand what the goals of that agency are and figure out, number one, whether or not you agree with all those goals, because MnDOT is an organization of 5,000 people, and I'm sure at least one or two people are doing things that are not perfect, just like any public agency. There's some things you want to fight against, and MnDOT's doing 98% great things, probably. So think about what do you want to actually attach your own art to and work towards achieving. And even if your end goal is to create a meaningful work of art, if you can understand what that agency will respond to and explain how your work can lead towards helping those outcomes, whether it's improving safety. I think Jack actually did a great job of this, talking about the roundabout. It started as, roundabouts are boring, and I totally agree, and there could be a work of public art. And perhaps that work of public art could help achieve MnDOT's #1 priority, which is to increase safety. That's sort of a live action, real-time example of how to do that. I also think it's important then for the public sector, the agencies themselves, and I talk to MnDOT folks and lots of other folks about this all the time, to understand that the art world, as Marcus keeps saying, is all of us, and everybody is creative, and a lot of agencies, maybe every agency over a few people, probably already have artists in residence. They're not acknowledged as that, but they're artists who are on staff. They're people who have private practice, making art, performing, they can sing, and they don't necessarily feel like there's perhaps a place to bring that creative practice in, but I'm biased. I want everyone to start an artist in residence program. I want to help all the agencies do that. But I think you can also look within to your own staff to think about who here has some sort of creative way of running this next meeting differently than we're already doing it, or who has an idea of how we can go out and talk to people, or who has family in this neighborhood and connect with them and tell us who or how we should run this next meeting, because it'll be responded to better by the people in this community. And think about the people you already have on board. And also think about the fact that artists are not a panacea for solving all the problems. And I sometimes hear this confusion between working with an artist and solving all the equity issues, or doing quality community engagement versus working with an artist. And I think artists can certainly help with that. And if you work with an artist in the wrong way, it can make things worse, perhaps. So don't think it'll solve all the problems, but think about the ways in which working with artists can lead you towards achieving your outcomes better. And also understand that there are many different kinds of artists who have different skill sets as well. And some artists are good with working with a video camera, for example, and others have never picked one up before. So important to assume, just like a civil engineer doesn't know anything about electrical engineering, a video artist maybe doesn't know anything about painting, and so on and so forth. I'll stop with that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for that call to action or recommendations for how we can bring art forward. I am hearing that I am no longer creative adjacent, I am a creative novice, and that I am in a room of fellow artists, and that we can work together to approach this problem with more of an interdisciplinary perspective, seek to understand where our work intersects and how there are opportunities for us to hit a middle ground. I also really liked the phrase gateway drug. It is liking me to the fact that we are earlier in this process. I think I also heard some comments that we need to be a little bit patient, but continue to collaborate to move this forward, and the gateway drug will give way to a positive epidemic in which we inoculate people. Sure, did I summarize that? All right, fantastic. Yeah, tie it up in a bow. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. Thank you to our three panelists for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I know that art and culture and transportation can be really complex, and I know that I feel like I'm walking out today better capable of bringing more art to transportation as we move forward. I do just want to remind, for AICP, we have the evaluation form. We have the log that you need to sign on your way out. We have another Forecast Forward event coming up November 14th about equity in architecture and design at Forecast Public Art. This conversation will be facilitated by Forecast board member Nathan Johnson, who's with Formula Architecture. I always just want to say Formula, but it's Formula Architecture. And it's featuring architect Satoko Maritake from 10 by 10 and Christine Miller, professor with the University of Minnesota. So mark your calendars for November 14th. And also be sure to see us on Forecast's website to find out more and to order the next edition of Public Art Review, which includes an article that highlights some of Marcus's work, but really digs down a little deeper into transportation and art. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists.